And then if some animals will end up with a GPS tag so that they can be tracked by biologists for a certain amount of time to make sure they're doing well before that equipment is removed. And then they're set to go.
Cool. So, according to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, there were over 100 rescues in 2022, but there were also 800 confirmed manatee deaths. So, I was wondering if you could tell us more about how manatee populations have changed over time in terms of like their mortality and also more causes of that. We've talked about a
Sure.
couple like stranding and boating incidents, but
So manatees are protected federally under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And part of the Endangered Species Act is that animals that are imperiled, species that are imperiled, need to be listed as endangered or threatened. And when manatees were originally protected under the Endangered Species Act, they were listed as endangered. It was estimated that there were around 1,000 of them. This was back in the 70s. And since then, through work from everyone in the manatee community and environmentalists protecting Florida's waterways, and by the creation of manatee protection zones, slow speed zones, manatees have been able to somewhat recover their population numbers and as I mentioned before, it was estimated in 2015, 2016 that there were around 8,000 animals, give or take, and about 4,000 on the West Coast, 4,000 on the East Coast. And in 2017, based on the increase in population numbers, manatees were downlisted from endangered to threatened under the endangered species list, saying, there's more of them, so they need less protections. They're doing well. But as a lot of us are familiar with, in late 2020, 2021, manatees started dying in huge numbers, and that is specific to the Indian River Lagoon, which is a location on Florida's east coast. It's considered critical habitat for manatees, so under the Endangered Species Act, it is considered habitat that is essential for manatees to survive. And historically, there has been lush seagrass beds there, but due to humans moving there and an increase in nutrients from fertilizers and septic tanks flowing into the lagoon, it caused algal blooms. So for algae, there's always algae in the water. It's naturally occurring. It's always there, and it usually doesn't cause any issue. In fact, a lot of animals feed off of it. But what happens when there's more nutrients in the system than there's supposed to be is that the algae can use it to grow out of control, and it'll end up blocking light to plants that need it. So in this case, it blocked light to the seagrasses that naturally grow in the lagoon. And then the algal blooms will then die and smother everything that's on the bottom. And this was happening every 2 years or so, starting in 2010, to the point where the seagrass just could not keep up. And we saw over 45,000 acres of seagrass lost from 2010 to 2019. So this is an area that manatees depend upon to survive. As I mentioned before, manatees use the same winter habitat year after year. And so they were going there in the wintertime expecting to find food to survive. Winter is already a hard time for manatees because they can't stay warm on their own, so they're restricted in where they can actually go. So once they're at a warm water site, it's not like they can travel very, very far to find food somewhere else. So they ended up in this area of the lagoon with no food, and they were starving. And a lot of the deaths in the Indian River Lagoon were due to starvation. Now, this is one specific case,
yeah.
because manatees all over Florida face different threats. But the starvation event is specific to the Indian River Lagoon.
What are some ways that Save the Manatee Club and other groups are working to kind of combat that issue in the Indian River Lagoon? I've heard of some seagrass replanting programs, but is there anything else or more to that you'd like us to hear?
Yes, so we we are doing quite a lot. One of the things we are doing is we have financially supported these groups that are doing restoration of the lagoon. So while it's not likely that restoring, replanting seagrass will restore all of the lost seagrass, it can help provide a buffer um, and provide a buffer for the system. You know, seagrass helps clean the water, and it also holds down sediment. So every time you get a storm coming through an area that doesn't have any type of plants on the bottom, you're going to get all of that sediment stirred up. And in the lagoon, a lot of that sediment on the bottom, as I said before, the algae died and sank to the bottom, and so it has a bunch of nutrients in it. And every time a storm comes through, it gets stirred up again, and that can cause another bloom. So having plants in the lagoon to hold down the sediment is very important. Groups are also they're planting clams, and they're regrowing oyster reefs, and they're planting mangroves along the shoreline, and we are helping through volunteers and outreach and financially to support a lot of these groups. Also doing presentations and outreach, and trying to support any projects that will help manatees. Another thing, sorry, I had a brain fart. We
That's
should definitely
okay.
include that in the podcast. um, another way that another way that we are trying to combat this problem is um, we were under the Endangered Species Act. If a federal government is in some way responsible or can play a part in restoration, can play a part in protecting the environment in some way, or if something in the environment is their fault, you could say, it is their responsibility to do something about it, um, or to talk to another government agency and figure out if there's a way that they can work together to solve the issue. And that's called reconsultation. And so we asked the Florida Fish and Wildlife, we asked the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the EPA to talk about improving the water quality standards for the Indian River Lagoon, because the way that the standards are set, it's not providing enough protection. And these standards are what a lot of Florida have to adhere to it. So if they made the protections stronger, it would reduce the amount of nutrients going into the lagoon. So that's something we're working on. We've also been big supporters of the provisioning program. So a lot of people have probably heard about the effort to feed manatees in the Indian River Lagoon. Um, in a lot of areas, there was no food at all, nothing. It was completely barren. And manatees were continuing to come to this area because that's where they go. That's what they do. And so in order to reduce the number of animals that needed to be rescued, um, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Cape Canaveral Energy Center power plant, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission worked together to create a pilot scale feeding program for manatees that were overwintering at the Cape Canaveral Energy Center. And at one point, there were over 800 manatees there feeding on the food that was available. During the unusual mortality event, which is what this die off of a lot of animals was called, there were, sorry, I'm like digging back deep because it was like 2 years ago now. What's it? During the unusual mortality event, a lot of animals were needing to be rescued, and most of the facilities we have that take in rescues were full. They were setting up temporary extra holding facilities for these animals because there were just so many. And starvation as a cause of needing to be rescued, it is not something where you just give them a little bit of food and they're good to go. It takes a very long time for them to regain muscle and fat, because everything is atrophied at that point. I mean, this is a chronic starvation. So in order to reduce the number of animals that would need to be rescued, providing food was what was chosen to do. And we think that it was definitely worthwhile.
Great. Sorry, that came out like very like this. Um, Great. So you mentioned power plants being involved in that initiative. How do they fit into the picture?
Sure. So historically, manatees would overwinter or seek sources of warm water during the wintertime at natural sources. So Florida springs are always 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Manatees need to be in water above 68 degrees in the wintertime in order to survive. So manatees would go to springs or to thermal basins. So that would be an area that is heated by the sun, or there's some type of density difference in the water that holds on to heat. Or they would go down south where it was warmer. A lot of manatees still do swim down to the Florida Keys in the wintertime. What has happened is power plants, when they were created, they provide an artificial source of warm water to the point where they have changed manatees' historical patterns of where they overwinter. At this point, over 60% of manatees are dependent upon artificial sources of warm water in the wintertime. And there has been a loss of springs in general, just from people developing or putting up dams and blocking access. Overpumping for water bottles has reduced flows in a lot of springs. And that reduced flow, on the one hand, it reduces the ability of the spring to hold as many manatees, because if it's not as warm or there isn't as much water, you can't have as many manatees in there. But also, less flow means less of these nutrients being pushed out, and so they end up settling in there and causing algal growth, and that completely upsets the spring system. So, but back to power plants, manatees are now dependent on these power plants, and if they shut off without warning, manatees are left without any access to warm water. So power plants have this thing called a manatee protection plan, where they need to have a plan in case of a catastrophic failure, or a plan to not attract more manatees than are already using the site by not having the water be as warm. So there are things in place to reduce manatees' dependence on power plants, but there is a question long term of most of these power plants